What's up, everybody? I'm here today to talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the reboot comic by Boom Studios, issue 3. Before I get into it, I did want to just quickly plug a new podcast I've got called Gilville. That's Gilville. You can find it on the Apple Podcast app. Would really appreciate it if you checked it out. I should say up front that this will be a spoiler review. If you haven't read the comic yet, I'd recommend you go and check out my non-spoiler review, then read the comic, then watch this video where I will be going into a lot more detail and spoiling just about everything that happens. Now, going into issue 3 of Buffy, there were a couple of concerns I had in mind. The first one is the sort of comic booky introductions we've gotten for some of the characters. Specifically, I'm thinking about issue 2, where Spike was introduced by basically Cordelia walking into the woods and finding Spike standing there. It felt a little bit like we want all your favorite characters to come back, even if we can't come up with a really interesting or creative way of introducing them. The other thing I was a little worried about is the treatment of the Xander character. I was a big fan of Xander in the show. The way they've portrayed him in the comics so far has felt a little one-note to me, where they're laying on very thick the fact that he's sad, lonely, feels very isolated and depressed. And in principle, I don't mind that as being his primary character trait, but it just feels like they're laying it on a little thick, and it would be great to get a change of pace for him. So let's get into issue 3, and we'll see if those concerns are addressed at all. The issue opens with Spike going to Anya's magic store, where, if you recall, Drusilla had released a giant vampire-killing monster. Now, one thing I was curious about going into this issue is how is this series going to handle the character of Anya? On the show, she started out in a sort of villainous role and then transitioned to the side of the heroes. In the comics so far, it's been ambiguous, but in this issue, we started to get a hint of where her allegiances lie. I'll read a couple lines from the comic here that give us some insight into that question and illuminate a couple of things that this comic is doing really well. So to set the scene, Anya has accused Drusilla of freeing the monster and putting them all in danger. She explains that that monster was supposed to be asleep for years until needed. In response to this accusation, Drusilla says, "This isn't my fault. Why do you keep that in your shop anyway? Until needed. What use would you have for that? What side are you on, Anyanka?" And then Anya replies, "I keep lots of things in this shop that do a lot worse. And don't make me explain this again. I'm Sweden. I don't take sides." And then Spike butts in and says, "You mean you're Switzerland?" Then Anya and Drusilla turn to Spike and tell him to shut up. I love that scene because not only does it give some insight into Anya, we learn that she's sitting in sort of a moral gray area, not exactly picking sides, and it shows a couple of things that this comic is great at, which I'd say is the humor and really accurately portraying the characters that we know from the show. I could easily see Anya on a classic episode of Buffy delivering these lines. Also important to note for those of you keeping track of where this comic is similar to the show and where it differs, I believe this is our first confirmation that Spike and Drusilla are involved in a romantic relationship. Now, one of my favorite scenes from Buffy of all time is when the Scooby Gang happened to walk in on Giles. I think it was at a cafe or a restaurant. They see Giles on the guitar singing the classic Behind Blue Eyes by The Who. No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man. I'll never forget that scene, so it was awesome in this issue to see Giles on his guitar, Spike walking by, noticing it, and then saying to himself, "Is that an Englishman? Butchering English classics. The horrors of this town." Then he looks up and sees the monster flying overhead, and in classic Spike fashion says to himself, "Oh, bullocks." And kudos to the artist, Dan Mora here. The look on Spike's face when he hears Giles singing is priceless. Pure horror. Now, I'm still not sure how to feel about the character Cordelia. In fact, if you watch my recap for issue 2, at a certain point, Cordelia approaches Willow with a big smile on her face. And in the recap, I called it a plastic smile, meaning it's disingenuous, that she's fake smiling, pretending to be happy. And I'm not sure if it was written that way intentionally or if I'm bringing some bias from the show. On the original Buffy television show, Cordelia was at first portrayed as sort of superficial, so I went into the comic expecting to see the same thing. But looking back, I think it's very possible I misread that scene. Cordelia might be a genuinely good person inside and out. In fact, here, when the monster attacks Spike at the restaurant, Cordelia picks up a string of lights and essentially lassos the monster. So not only might she be a good person, but here she actually does something heroic. So I wonder, are they skipping the part where we don't like Cordelia at first and then she turns out to be good? Or are we going to see some layers to her and find out that she seems great, but as you scratch under the surface, there's a few rough edges? Now, my favorite part of the issue comes shortly after Cordelia's encounter with the monster. Buffy finally gets to the monster and then she punches it, and as the monster struggles to stand back up, it speaks and it asks Buffy, "Why, Slayer? Why Slayer hurt?" And again, kudos to the artist, because watching the monster's face shift from vicious, monstrous to sad and confused and genuinely hurt was pretty hilarious and a little touching. As the monster has this sort of sad sack look, it goes on to say, "Kamazots," that's his name apparently, "help Slayer, always. Kamazot's only purpose, protect Slayer, kill vampires." And then Buffy, seeking to clarify, asks if that means the monster is like her Pegasus. And maybe even funnier than how sad and hurt the monster looked after Buffy punched him, the look of confusion on its face when he hears Pegasus is again pure gold. After that, Buffy meets Spike for the first time, and as with a lot of other things in this comic, it doesn't go quite as expected. The two of them prepare for a fight, and then, like it's nothing, Buffy snatches the necklace off Spike's neck. And this is another one of those necklaces that protects a vampire and apparently allows them to survive a stake to the heart. I thought for the first interaction between Buffy and Spike, this was pretty solid. Like I said, it didn't go entirely as expected, and they had some decent back and forth. So I mentioned earlier I was a little worried about how heavily they were hitting the Xander is depressed and lonely note, that I was looking for a change of pace, and thankfully we got that here. Because as Drusilla sneaks up behind Buffy to bite her neck, Xander shows up and smacks her over the head with a shovel. Then he takes a super heroic, badass pose. I will say that I had a feeling earlier that they might be setting up Xander for a sort of villainous role. And if you take a look at the panel right after Xander hits Drusilla, when he's standing in his heroic pose, the monster is directly behind him and almost makes it look sort of like Xander has demonic wings, just with the way the monster's behind him. And I do wonder if that's foreshadowing. We'll see. I do also want to highlight some of the nuance in this scene, which is that it's not Xander and Willow show up and Buffy's happy to see them. You can tell she's a little taken aback, and she even says she's not used to having that sort of assistance. So as with the Spike scene, I enjoy seeing that nuance. I enjoy seeing them twist things a little bit so not everything goes as expected, and they keep things interesting. Then Giles shows up with a charm that he got from Willow, and he puts the monster back to sleep. And that's an interesting point there, because up to this point, we haven't had any hints about Willow being into witchcraft, about Willow at all being involved in the supernatural, and here it looks like Giles is starting to actually use her for help. And it was interesting that Willow was able to obtain that charm for Giles. Did Giles give her specific instructions and it was just a matter of her going to pick it up? Or does Willow have some knowledge in this field? Did she have it before she met Giles, or is this a recent development? So if you watch the Buffy TV show, then you know that over time Willow gets more and more involved in witchcraft until she's a full-blown witch. Are they introducing that element earlier in the series in this iteration? it looks like they might be. Now, in terms of the pacing, in general, I think this comic is doing really well with it. And it's tough. When you're trying to take a show that had the nuance and complexity of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and tell it in little bite-sized pieces once a month, it can be hard to slowly pace yourself, have a little bit of action, but still have time for the characters to breathe, develop, and build relationships. Overall, I think it's doing a great job with that, but it did suffer a little bit towards the end of the issue. So the first example would be around Cordelia. And I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of intrigued with her character, not quite sure what they're doing with her yet, and we maybe started to get a hint of it here. After all the mayhem, after the monster has been captured and put to sleep, Cordelia looks at Buffy and says, "Sorry, I thought I could be nice and friendly to everyone in Sunnydale, but all of you are too weird for me. And you," points at Buffy, "you're going to get everyone killed doing whatever it is you do." Then Willow says, "Yeah, probably." And that's the end of the conversation. To me, it felt like that conversation was cut way short. And I would have liked to have seen another panel or two, seeing more of the interaction between Cordelia and Buffy, especially after witnessing this crazy event unfold. And then Giles approaches Buffy and essentially tells her that she did a great job taking care of the monster and apologizes that maybe he's been a little bit hard on her and that he's proud of her. Honestly, to me, it felt like that came a little out of nowhere. If you look at issue 2, Giles was very hard on Buffy, but I didn't really watch him experience anything this issue that would have caused him to change his stance so much. From "I'm worried you're not taking enough responsibility" to "I'm very proud of you." Now, of course, Buffy did face down the big vampire-killing beast, but overall, and maybe again this just comes back to pacing, the transition for Giles just felt a little too quick for me. I would have liked to have seen it breathe a little bit and just take its time a little bit more, rather than feeling like a switch was flipped from "you're not taking enough responsibility" to "I'm very proud of you, Buffy." The next scene gives us a hint at what's coming up in the following issues, because apparently Drusilla was able to snatch Buffy's phone, and on it she sees a picture of Willow and Xander. And then Drusilla hints to Spike that next, they're going to be going after Buffy's friends and potentially killing one or both of them. I'm looking forward to seeing how that shows, because if I recall correctly, the interactions between Xander and Spike on the show were pretty funny. They didn't come until later on, and it looks like we may get a hint of that sooner in this iteration. Also, if you pay attention to the way Spike is acting in this scene with Drusilla, I'm getting the vibe that Drew might be a little more evil than Spike. So I have a feeling that as the two of them go after Willow and Xander, there might come a point where Spike either defends Willow and Xander or holds back a little bit if he feels like Drusilla is taking things too far. Now, once again, spoilers for the Buffy TV show, but if you watch that show, then you know that over time, Spike did switch from bad guy to good guy. This could be the first hint that that's coming. It feels a little bit early if you compare it to the series, to the TV series, but there's a lot of things that are happening earlier in the comic than they did in the show. So it's possible we might see a good guy Spike much earlier than we did in the original TV series. It's worth noting that in this comic, we don't know a whole lot about vampires yet. On the show, they established a lot of rules about the soul. Vampires are essentially pure evil. Is that the case here? Is it a little bit more nuanced? We'll have to wait and see. Anyway, overall, I have to say I'm really impressed with this series so far. It's a little too early to say it's great. It's too early to say that I love it, but I'm very happy with the way it's going. I do think I might be a little biased, that I might be inflating how good it is, just because I went in with such low expectations. And I was so concerned about what this comic could do to the legacy of the original series, especially since this starts the whole continuity over. So the Buffy that we've been watching for over a decade, the Buffy that had continued in the Dark Horse comics, it's all erased. It's all starting over. So I went in with a lot of concerns. And I might just be so impressed with the fact that this comic doesn't suck. No pun intended. Suck like vampires. Either way, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can't wait to read issue 4, which I believe is out April 4th. Make sure to subscribe to this channel for more reviews, more recaps like this one, and hit the little bell icon to make sure you're notified whenever I post a new video. And please check out my new podcast, Gillville. Like I said, you can find it on the Apple Podcast app. Thanks for watching.